Hey everyone, this is Andy Hall. If you're watching this live and you're here in the States, congratulations, you're up at the crack of dawn. However, my guest, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, he is not here in the States. He is over in Great Britain. I believe it should be about noontime over there, Jonathan.
This is lunchtime. I mean, the things I give up for you.
Right. Well, it is greatly appreciated, sir. I'm glad that you're here. Before we get into the nitty and the gritty, we should at least go over your background. We should go over what you're good at, what you're an expert at, because we're going to get into your current beef, or the beef, if I could be so bold, with Christian apologist William Lane Craig. And probably starting off with your credentials would be a good place to start.
Well, I've got a bachelor's degree, a postgraduate certificate of education, a master's in philosophy. I've been writing on philosophy for 10 years or so now. I have 10 books on the philosophy of religion broadly, and a blog with something like 3,200 blog posts, which I calculated recently is at least 1 million, maybe 2 million words of work. So, over that period of time, a huge volume of work. And the idea of blogging, I mean, I often get asked, why do you blog? And it's kind of a twofold thing. It's branding yourself out there. So if you want to sell books and stuff like that, you've got to have a presence, right? And a channel to do that. So that's part of it. And I'll admit that. And the tiny bit of income that comes with that. But predominantly it's to put your ideas out there so that they are attacked and either stand and you know that you're correcting them, or they fall and you refine them so that they become better ideas. So it's almost like the scientific method, right? You're just refining and refining and refining, which in philosophy is absolutely essential, so that you know, or that you have good faith. We'll come on to that in what you are saying, in that you are correct, that you've got good faith is a wrong word there, that you've got good rational basis for believing what you do. And that's really important for me. I suppose everyone would say this, but for me, it's really important that what I believe is rational and sound and valid. And if you build up a wall, it doesn't have holes in the wall here and there, because I just couldn't sleep at night. I need to know that what I believe is sound. And so therefore this whole idea of blogging, the amount that I do, is about doing that. The flip side is that I've got to a stage in blogging where I get so many comments on my blog, whereas I used to read every single comment and then be able to adjust my views accordingly. There are just too many now. And then I wonder, is this just about me just throwing stuff out there and not being able to refine it so much because I can't read everything that people is commenting?
Well, that's the thing about being a content creator of any kind, whether or not you're anything from YouTube to blogging. They're just, when you get a certain amount of popularity, there are hundreds of comments, hundreds. Yeah. I've looked at your blog posts, and actually I've read a few too, which we'll get into in a minute. And there are hundreds of comments.
Yeah.
Hundreds. And no one person can look at those comments, think about them, reflect, and then write a response.
Yeah,
it's impossible, because then you wouldn't be able to put out new content.
Yeah, and so when I try and do, say, 2 blog posts a day, I do have other people that write sort of for my blog, and if each of them is attracting anywhere between 100 and 2,000 comments, and you're like, every day, that's a voluminous amount of stuff to read, and I still do skim them all at least, but. Yeah, it's a difficult process, right? To keep an eye on.
So, what started the discussion? We'll call it like this, between you and Mr. William Lane Craig. Are, from what I understand, 2 blog posts that you wrote. One, and I put the links down in the comment, in the description in this YouTube video, is the Resurrection, Fideism, and Circularity, and the other one has to do with motivated reasoning.
Yeah. And supernaturalism. Yeah, well, I suppose the basis of this, what happened is a couple of people alerted me to the fact that his podcast, he does a reasonable faith podcast for his website quite often. And they took my 2 blog posts and went to town on them. And it's worth noting the word they there, because actually William Lane Craig has a team. I don't think he read my blog post at all. And I think that's part of the problem, is that what happens is his team scour the internet, look for stuff to talk about. One of his team will have read them, and then his co-presenter on the podcast will present the topic and then read paragraphs to William Lane Craig, who will then react to those paragraphs, completely decontextualized. So William Lane Craig, I doubt, has ever read any of my articles. So he's then presented with these completely out of context paragraphs that his co-presenter reads with derision. I mean, he read each paragraph dripping with derision. And then Craig responds and then absolutely hammers me for things that are completely unfair, right? And so I took issue with that, not from sour grapes, but because, as I explained before, I'm a minnow, right? I've got a blog and books that I sell only handfuls of, and I'm just scraping by at the moment because, you know, pandemic, I've had to take early ill health retirement from teaching, blah, blah, blah. So when my brand, if you like, gets very publicly assaulted on a platform that is relatively huge compared to mine, then actually that has some significance to me personally. Right. So if everything he says stands up, then that's fine, and I need to go away and really think about how I'm conducting myself philosophically. But when the things that were said were so patently ridiculous and decontextualized, or his approach was that I actually took issue with this. Whether he'll ever look at my gripes, I doubt it. But it's just annoying that someone with a huge platform can use their platform in what I think is a really disingenuous manner, and therefore poisoning the well for all his readership against me in a very, what I think is unfair way, because I don't think his criticisms stand up at all.
Well, you know, it seemed like the idea of, I could see how his people, when looking at blogs for him to attack, they looked at the word Fideism, and it alerted them to, like, oh, well, this is something that we can attack Jonathan on. You want to talk about Fideism and why that attacks the William Lane Craig brand specifically?
Yeah, well, actually, so William Lane Craig is an evidentialist. So he produces books like Reasonable Faith that present evidence for Christianity. This is why he's so big on the resurrection, right? Because without it, Christianity kind of falls apart. So if you can establish it historically, which is evidence. So he spends an awful lot of time in his debates and his books establishing the historical basis, supposed historical basis of the resurrection. So he's an evidentialist. So when I say that actually belief in the New Testament is somewhat based on faith, which is belief without evidence, Fideism is this kind of belief without evidence. This is belief on sort of faith alone. Then he's going to take issue that actually that's what represents Christianity. And I'm not necessarily saying that actually that is what Christianity is. I'm saying there's an interesting area where people who believe in the New Testament, you say, well, why do you believe the New Testament? Well, because I have faith in Jesus. And it's like, well, that's what it's looking to prove. So if you're going to plug that into the beginning, if you're going to say supernaturalism is a plausible worldview, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm starting with that assumption that supernaturalism is plausible. Then I'm going to use that to evaluate the New Testament, which then concludes that supernaturalism is true. Mm-hmm. Then that feeds back into my idea that supernaturalism is plausible. Do you see what I'm saying? So
yeah, definitely. And tell me if I'm wrong on this, Jonathan, is that Craig would say, after listening to his podcast, is that his definition of faith is the idea of belief grounded on the best or the most likely thing that happened, or it conforms to facts. Is that basically what he's saying?
Where it gets interesting. So the way I like to think about it is like, I don't know, real simple. I just drew this up literally 5 minutes ago. So here you have like, I don't know, some kind of proposition and the belief that it's true. And you fill it up with evidence. And then at the top, you might have a bit of faith, which I would say is belief without absent of evidence, right? So this is what faith does. It gets you to the belief in a proposition, and some people see that as hope. Some people see, I mean, the problem is with faith is that there are different definitions, but this is how I would read it, which is to say that if I believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, actually it's going to look much more like this, which is a tiny bit of doubt. Right, I've got a shed load of evidence that the sun will rise tomorrow, but something crazy could happen. I might be a brain in a vat and living in a matrix or whatever. And so there's a little bit here that I have to fill with faith, which is evidence, which is belief without evidence. Okay. Now, the question is, what does a Christian do? What will it look like? Will it look like this, which is a load of faith here and not a lot of evidence? Or does a Christian believe actually that have shed loads of evidence? Well, if it's trust in this evidence, do they have extra trust in that because they're a Christian? Is there a circularity? Is this confirmation bias? So we have the same evidence. A Christian and I have the same evidence, and we're appraising the same evidence. So how can they give that amount of value to rational evidence and only a little bit to doubt, to overcoming doubt? Whereas I would look at the belief in Christianity as being true as something like this, where the rational evidence is down here, and in order to believe it's true, that the rest of that is faith, right?
Tell me if I'm wrong on this. William Lane Craig would say that he would look at your graphs, your pictures, and say, well, he would reverse that around and say atheists are motivated thinkers. And there's all this evidence out there for God, but because you're so motivated in thinking, you devalue it.
So this is where it comes. So really, if we've got the same evidence, it comes down to how we appraise the evidence. And what do we put into that machine at the beginning? So no one's objective. It would be great is if William Lane Craig and myself approached the God question or the Christian question in completely objective manner, in the same way that maybe we would approach the Islam question, right? So but we don't, because he will ascribe more value to a claim that confirms Christianity than I would, and I would ascribe more value to a claim that defends atheism than he does. And so therefore, why are our metrics different? And then you have to really start getting into psychology, which is why psychology is important. And motivated reasoning is interesting. Now, in this podcast, he took me up on motivated reasoning, right? And then just asserted this claim that atheists are way more susceptible to motivated reasoning than theists. And he knows that because he was in Canada once and met this bloke that told him so. And that's basically what his case was on the podcast.
Let me just say this, because I wrote this out, because I found this to be, and you know, doing comedy, I try to find funny things in everything that I come across. And William Lane Craig on the podcast goes, I never, to paraphrase, not word for word, I've never met people more prone to bias than atheists. And I'm saying to myself, that sounds like I've never met people who don't agree with me than people who don't agree with me.
Yeah, and it's also ignoring this rather huge issue of motivation. So motivated reasoning is motivation to believe something, to find reasons to believe in a certain proposition, right? So how motivated are you, and will that color the way that you are evaluating the claims? Now, when you are a Christian, right, if you don't believe, or if you're an atheist, if you're looking at an atheist as a Christian, if that atheist doesn't believe, or if I as a Christian come to not believe, then I will go to hell. If I do believe, and I believe in a way I think is correct, then I'm going to go to heaven. They are the single biggest conceptual carrots and sticks that you can ever have. There is nothing worse than hell and nothing better than heaven. There literally isn't. Those are almost definitionally what heaven and hell are. And so therefore, if you're talking about motivated reasoning, telling me that atheists have it worse, and yet over your head, you have heaven and hell hanging on whether you believe or don't believe in Christianity, then you're talking nonsense. You're just talking nonsense.
I'm gonna give you I'm gonna lob a ball right into the strike zone for you using an American baseball analogy here. Gosh, Jonathan, how does skepticism insulate us or give us insurance against motivated thinking?
So I will let the ball bounce and hit it with my cricket bat. And,
very good.
And it goes for a 6. So the great thing about skepticism is that actually everything's fair game, right? And so you just take your God disbelief one God extra than the Christian. I know that's a Dawkinsism, but actually it's really good. Like there's a massive double standard to Christians, which is they reject the holy books based on the same form of testimony and the same disbelief of miracle claims, and those they are skeptics for every other religion, but when it comes to theirs, it just gets a free pass. And with skeptics, we're like, okay, even though this means I might go to hell, I am going to approach this in a skeptical manner. Now, I'm going to be bringing baggage to this, of course, and no one is able to completely mitigate cognitive biases, right? So we're all going to bring baggage to the table. But if I understand that, and I'm talking about it all the time, and I'm blogging about cognitive biases and saying here it is there, then at least I'm aware of it, and I will try and admit when I am possibly susceptible to a particular bias in a given situation. But I agree that no one is not prone to these sort of biases. But the skeptic, I think. I have changed my mind through philosophy on basically every major position. So if you're talking about motivated reasoning, for example, William Lane Craig, I have changed my mind on Christianity and God, morality, free will, what abstract ideas are made of, politics, immigration, you name every major argument you could possibly have. And I've changed my mind in light of rational evidence. So don't tell me that atheists are more prone to. I know this is an anecdote and this is just me, but I like to think I follow the evidence and change my mind accordingly. You might think I'm a very dogmatic thinker and arguer, but actually I do take on board other positions, and I have empirically changed my mind on pretty much every major decision. Has William Lane Craig done that, or has he been a Christian all his life and then go further and further and further into that world, so that actually he has so much literally invested in it financially, that he can't extricate himself from belief in Jesus, because he would lose his entire life, his entire earnings, a massive set of organizations he's set up, and networks and all this kind of stuff. He has an awful lot to motivate him to believe what he does.
Sure enough. There were a few things in his podcast, little 30-minute podcast about which is titled Resurrection, Fideism, and Circularity, from November 9th, 2020, that he says that the Gospels are just as reliable as other historical documents. And I felt that was, to use the colloquial term, a whopper. I can tell that you're rubbing, you're about to have an aneurysm. And so if you are, I'll give you applause.
So he likes to think that, and he will argue the toss over the reliability of the Gospels. The simple fact of the matter, this is how I like to see it. Imagine I, in 30 years' time, come to believe that David Koresh from Waco is the Messiah, right? And after believing this, so this is what's called ex post facto. So after I believe he's a Messiah, I then come to write a history, or what some people would think is a historical account of David Koresh's life. But I already believe he's a Messiah, and my main driver for writing this is to evangelize that idea, and to convince those who read what I write of the same thing that I believe. Right. So this is an evangelistic text that I am writing to convince other people to believe David Koresh is a Messiah. I've never met David Koresh, and it's unlikely I've met any of his followers. After all, I'm writing in a different country. I do not have access to the internet. I do not have access to the telephone. I do not have access to public transport or sound methods of transport quickly, right? I have no way of verifying my facts. I have no way of seeing that what I write is verifiable in the people that in the audience it's aimed at. And so therefore, when you 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, come to look at my account of David Koresh's life, is that reliable? Hope you would say no, because and that it's an ex post facto, agenda driven, non-eyewitness account evangelizing a particular stance and belief, and that's what it is, and that's what the Gospels are. They're interrelated, they're based on each other, they're not multiple attestations, they are blah 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 blah, and we could go on and on and on as to why I think these are not reliable accounts. Now, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Andy, I've got a kid, right? I've got a child. What do you do with that claim?
Okay. Well, that doesn't seem to be, you're not saying the child is a unicorn or anything like that. No. So it's like, all right, that seems to be pretty reasonable. And the thing is, I could go on your Facebook page right now and see if you do have a kid.
Yeah. Andy, I've got a dragon that lives in my bath and it flies to the moon every Tuesday while singing Rule Britannia.
Well, I would check. I would ask you why it would be singing Real Britannia, because that seems a little imperialistic, to tell you the truth, and out of date. But otherwise,
the existence of a dragon flying to the moon, just its intentions for singing Rule Britannia and its nationalistic pride.
Well, I find that disturbing myself. But jokes aside, I would ask you. It's like, so any evidence for that?
Exactly. So the idea is that you would probably only believe that claim if you actually saw it with your own eyes. I mean, really. So what this says is, in a very simple way, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is self-evidently true, right? And so when it comes to the claims of the New Testament, which are absolutely extraordinary, you've got darkness and earthquakes and saints parading around Jerusalem during the crucifixion. You've got miracles aplenty. You've got a God born miraculously in human form, and all the miracles that take place, all these crazy stuff. You're like, okay, these are incredible, literally incredible claims.
Yes.
We need huge quality evidence to establish these claims as being reasonable to believe. Do the Gospels constitute amazing evidence? Are these like truly sublime evidence to support such incredible claims? And the simple answer is, go back to my David Koresh accounts or analogy. These are not really good sources of evidence, and Craig would have you otherwise. And this is what underwrites why I would adhere to this account where like the quality of evidence is poor. You have to overcome. For me to believe that, I would have to believe it by using predominantly faith.
Right.
He believes that because he has ascribed this amount of value extra to the evidence than I did. Now the question is, why is he able to say that the Christian sources, that the gospel accounts are really good forms of evidence and ascribe all this value to them, and I don't? And is it what we're bringing to the table? Is it the motivated reasoning that we have, or is there something just wrong in his evaluation, or is he so desperate for it to be true? But then he could say that to me. Am I so desperate for it to be false that I ascribe very low amounts of evidence value to the evidence?
Well, to use that phrase, a tree by the fruit that it bears, Jonathan. And listening just from this, like I said, 30-minute podcast episode of Craig's, I had to listen to this bit like maybe 4 or 5 times for me to wrap my mind around this, to see if he actually said it. It's around 18 minutes, and he says basically about religious experiences, right? About the nature of religious experiences, and he charges that just because non-Christians don't have Christian religious experiences, that doesn't mean Christian religious experiences are meaningless in terms of knowing what's true. And then he goes on to say that you haven't read all and this is another argument that that burns me, Jonathan. It burns me when people say that you haven't read all of the commentary on the X-Men, and so you cannot figure out whether or not the X-Men are true or not. That's basically part of it. And but once again, back to this pit in the podcast, he goes, but, and I'm not making this up, belief in God can be based on an experience of God.
Only. So what was, this is a hugely problematic position that he was taking, which is to say that, okay.
Well, am I right? Is that his position? Is that something that he says?
It's kind of a fallback position,
Okay.
which is to say that, okay, if you think all the evidence is complete nonsense, if you think the Gospels are rubbish, that doesn't mean that you aren't justified in believing in being Christian. So I was talking about an Amazonian tribes person who's never ever experienced, never knows. So I'm talking about Fideism, right, and about how evidence, and this, it goes back to circularity. In order to have a revelation of God, you need to actually know about the Bible. You need to have found out about the evidence through a preacher or through a missionary or through reading the Bible yourself. No one in an Amazonian tribe who's never heard of anything to do with Christianity has a revelation about Jesus, right? Would understand all of that. And so Craig was going off on one saying, actually, no, you can have justified belief without evidence through personal revelation. And I'm like, when has that ever happened? Like, conceptually, you can, Craig. Like, you could imagine someone in 5000 BCE, right, just suddenly having a revelation of Jesus as would be in 5,000 years' time. But they would have to have that revelation of everything to be able to understand who Jesus is. Place, you'd almost have to have the New Testament revealed to you in your mind, right? In order for that but that's never happened. No one has ever had such a revelation about Christianity without knowing anything about Christianity before, and then had the entire rational basis for Christianity inputted into their brains. Just like, so your point is kind of moot, Dr. Craig, because that's never happened, and I can't see that ever happening ever. So conceptually, yes, you could come to believe in Christianity without rational evidence, without evidence, tangible evidence, but that doesn't happen, and it's not going to happen. So whatever.
Right. And when I hear Craig say something like, you have to do all the reading to be able to refute this, I think of Hitchens when he said that, or to paraphrase Hitchens, it's so absurd, I can just wave it away because of the absurdity. Well,
that wasn't what annoyed me, because although that's true, so what he basically said is, you can't come to these kind of conclusions. You need to go away and do some reading on natural theology, on reformed epistemology, on this and that. It's like, how do you know I haven't, right? I've written 3,200 blog posts, mate. I've written 10 books. I've written a book against you, William Lane Craig. One of my books is Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. That is natural theology. It's an entire book on natural theology against Dr. Craig. So how dare he come along and say, you need to do more reading on natural theology? Because all he's doing is hearing these paragraphs out of context and not knowing anything about me, what I've written, what I've read, and said, well, he's not read enough, has he? Because he doesn't believe what I believe. And I've read all these things. It's like, how do you know I haven't read those things as well? And I know I've written like at least 3 books about natural theology. Jog on. I'm absolutely astounded by what I think was not only disingenuous but rude. It's like, don't second guess who I am and what I know by what your co-presenter is derisorially reading out to you now, and it's the first time you've ever heard it.
Yeah. Even as my crappy role as a crappy comedian and blogger, when I do a joke, when I write about something, I try to keep my hits technical. If I'm going to use a boxing analogy here, I try to make sure they land and that I have firm footing when I land those hits. And it just seemed very sloppy to me about Craig's podcast.
And that's, I would agree with you. And that's because it can, to give it a topical analogy, it's a bit like Trump and disinformation, which is the fact that he can go and say whatever he likes because he knows his audience will suck it up and not challenge it. And therefore, they will buy into the Trump brand and continue buying Trump's stuff, right? So William Lane Craig can do exactly the same. His audience aren't going to challenge him. His Christian audience certainly aren't going to challenge him. And no one's going to hear me as some kind of, minor league, I wanted to make a baseball analogy there just to make you happy, as some minor league player on the sidelines, spouting off. None of his readers and none of his acolytes are going to come and pay attention to me. So he can get away with saying that, and he does. And I just think that is disingenuous. I just think that's poor form.
I think what I want to go back to, most scholars believe. Whenever I hear that, and I've heard it from of course more than Craig. I've heard it from people on our side. I'm not going to give out any names right now, but I hear most scholars believe, and when a person over relies on that argument, it sounds as if they don't want to show you the math. It's almost as if they're hiding their main argument away and using a shield of most scholars believe.
So is this an argumentum ad populum? So most people believe it, therefore it's true. When you're looking at something like climate science, that is actually how science works. It works by consensus, and actually is a really useful tool to use, which is to say that, okay, 97% of the scientists believe that this, and they are the scientists who work in that area and are investigating it, hopefully objectively, and using a scientific method whereby if they make a claim, those claims are able to be attacked by everyone else and adjusted accordingly. And so therefore the scientific method works to refine, to get you towards a greater truth over time. Religious epistemology doesn't do that, okay? Doesn't have a self-correcting mechanism. Science does. So when you say most scientists believe this, it does have some force, right? Now, science does have things that change. It's like if we went with most scientists believe this and stuck with that forever, then no scientific theories would ever be overturned and you wouldn't find new. So that is a good rule of thumb, as long as you understand that actually this is open to change and adaptation and whatnot. What Craig does is he uses, and this has been, I'm writing a book on the resurrection and I write a whole chapter on this. He uses this really common claim, which is 75%. It comes from Gary Habermas. 75% of New Testament scholars believe in the empty tomb. So you're like, okay, who are these New Testament scholars? So here's an analogy. 100% or 99.9% of Islamic scholars believe in the truth of the Quran. Using your claim, then you should believe in the Quran. The end of. Okay? So using that technique doesn't work for the Quran, so it shouldn't work for your. So what I'm trying to say is there's a selection bias going on. So if sort of 97%, I'm pulling that number out, of New Testament scholars are Christian, then 75% of them believing is interesting. Actually, I would expect there to be more than 75%. I'm quite amazed that 25% of New Testament scholars don't believe in it. I actually think that's a very poor percentage. But actually, there have been people who have done analyses of Gary Habermas's, and the problem is he's never published his methodology and his stats. So this is a really dodgy claim. But taking, looking at Habermas's claims, it looks like he pretty much discounted agnostics and atheists, and so New Testament scholars. And so basically, you just have this completely nonsense statistic that is effectively meaningless. And the fact that Craig trotted it out.
And it could be inflated. I mean, I just want to highlight that point, because if you don't see the math of how he came up with that number, he has an incentive probably to inflate that number. So I remember first hearing this like 10 years ago. And I remember just when I was really getting into biblical sort of criticism and whatnot, I remember emailing every single university in Britain and asking, freedom of information type thing, asking what proportion of their students believed, to every faculty that taught theology, I think it was. And I said,
can you let me know what proportion of your students are Christian and what proportion non-Christian, New Testament studies and theology, and the same with your faculty members. And I got very few responses, but the responses I did get were basically that everyone is Christian. So what this told me was, okay, I don't have a lot of data here, but it looks like almost everyone who learns New Testament studies and theology at university is Christian. I mean, why would you want to go to university at the age of 18 and learn New Testament studies unless you were either a Christian wanting to solidify your Christian belief, or an atheist at the age of 18 who was so interested in that stuff they just wanted to get involved to smash it about? So you are going to have a massive preponderance of Christians who are New Testament scholars, or learning to be New Testament scholars, and that they believe in the empty tomb story is obvious, is meaningless, whatever. The fact that there's only 75% to me tells me actually you've got more of a problem. Don't use that evidence to support your position. I would say that's a bit low.
Sure. So we went over a few what I picked out of Lang's podcast episode from the 2 blog posts that you wrote. What have I missed? Is there what other things that got you going, or that you said to yourself, well, he doesn't have me right on this?
Well, it's just, I mean, for someone who's like, you need to go and do a lot of reading. So what's happening is these were 2 very quick blog posts I wrote. Okay. Mm-hmm. And most of the time I do make links to other pieces, but my blogging is cumulative, which is to say that the people who have taken along with me on my journey, they understand that this blog is where I'm at now based on everything that's gone before it. 3,200 blog posts have gone before it. And so therefore I'm not pulling this blog out of my arse. This is established on a sound what I think is a sound foundation. So if you're going to challenge this, you actually need to go and challenge all my foundations as well. Now, don't come along and take this and say, this has no foundation. He needs to go and do some reading here because this has no foundation, because actually it's got a massive amount of foundation. So all I'd say is, you know what, just find out a little bit about me. Look at what I've written. I've got category list on my blog. You can very quickly go and search things up and tags and everything that we all do. And I've got 10 books that you can go and read, and it's there for you. But then to do a podcast which makes that mistake and then make assertions itself that aren't based and showing to be based on sound evidence. So I could go to Craig, I say, you probably need to go and read a little bit about the psychology of religion here, because I could talk to you about whether Christians have greater motivated reasoning than atheists, and what are the psychological hooks for Christians, and mortality salience and all these kind of things that from your podcast it seems like you don't know. So there's an element of hypocrisy there as well, which is like, it appears to be like, look at Jonathan Pearce, he's asserting these things out of nowhere, right? And by saying that, you're defending your position by asserting things out of nowhere.
Right.
I think there's double standards, hypocrisy. I think it was disingenuous. There are other minor things to bring out about it, but the 75% of scholars is a great example. The Bayes, but using Bayes' theory, we talked a little bit about that, about what you put in the function machine to get out the end of it. And if you're going to start with the assumption that supernaturalism is true, then when you approach the New Testament, that is going to inform how you interpret that. But then you could say that the same for the atheists, right? And so, but I understand this, and I talk about this openly, and I discuss both sides of the argument. And so, but it looks like he didn't do that in that podcast, certainly. So, what does that say about him?
Right. So from the chat, I just want to say hello to everyone in the chat. Jonathan and I just jumped right into the material. I'm a bad person in terms of interacting with people in the chat. I found this interesting. This recent comment from Vesta. I'm probably butchering the name. So 100% of YouTube flat earthers believe the earth to be flat. Using William Lane Craig logic, he should believe the earth to be flat.
Yes. Well, so again, it all depends on your reference set. So if your reference set is a bunch of kooks who aren't blah blah blah, then who? I suppose the question is, what majority of people, what consensus is a reasonable consensus to go along with? So here I would say experts in the subject that I don't know much about, which is kind of morally neutral in a sense. So something like some kind of scientific claim about climate science, although it does get politicized and stuff, is different than New Testament scholars talking about the New Testament. And so it's discussing the reference set and how they have arrived at their conclusions, and whether those conclusions are open to be attacked by people who are equally experts in that, who don't believe the same thing. And then what happens to those original scientists who have their papers criticized? In other words, this is a scientific method that adapts, changes the conclusions, and the people take on new evidence to form new conclusions, whereas New Testament scholarship appears to be pretty much where it was 1,000 years ago. Yes, there is refining, but it's not a self-correcting epistemological mechanism. There's only one decent self-correcting knowledge mechanism, and that is a scientific method. And until something else comes along that shows itself to be as robust as that, then I'm not as interested. But,
right. A reasonable point of view, AA from the chat from a while back, even if there was evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, does that actually prove God? Or does that just prove a man was killed and came back to life and we don't know how?
Well, of course, it depends what you mean by evidence, but this is where you have to do kind of Bayesian probability analyses, I would say. So, for example, an analogy of how you do Bayes might be that I'm in Portsmouth, my local town in the UK, my local city, and I see bushes move, right? So I say it's either wind or it's a tiger. So using my background knowledge and the evidence of just it moving, then I'm going to say that it's wind, because tigers don't live in Britain. But then if I have other bits of evidence that come to play, such as like, I've heard in the news last night that a tiger escaped from the circus in Portsmouth, and I saw a bit of orange and black in the bush as it moved, then actually I've got more warrant to believe in the fact that or in the claim that it's a tiger, the hypothesis. And so, you're constantly changing these things, these hypotheses, with new evidence that comes on board. So when you say, well, okay, someone definitely resurrected, well, actually, what do you mean by resurrected? What do you mean by definitely? And what's my background knowledge, and what's the evidence here? And can something else better explain that? And blah blah blah. And so it's just really difficult without knowing all of these variables. But I think the problem for the theist is that I can give an explanation of what happened, say, in the empty tomb, that sounds utterly implausible, and it's still going to be more probable than the Christian thesis, which is that a God figure, that a God came to life as a human, did a bunch of miracles, and then died on a cross to pay for all our sins, which we're not quite sure of how that works, by the way. Not even Christian theologians, they disagree on how atonement works, right? All this stuff, and that is best explains the data of an empty tomb, rather than the fact that some itinerant preacher died and, I don't know, someone walked in and nicked a body, and people had hallucinations. Well, that's already more plausible, and I've just pulled that one out on my posterior. Right, so so looking at the resurrection claims would require, what's your hypothesis, what's the data, and how are you going to evaluate the data against each hypothesis? And so I don't know, I haven't answered the question.
You probably know, you definitely know much more about William Lane Craig than I do. But when I think about Craig, I think about, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, please, about his position with, I think it was divine command theory about, and this is years ago when it was up in the atheist zeitgeist, he was writing or talked about how the ancient Israelites, soldiers going through their blitzkrieg invasion of the land of Canaan, they would kill babies and women, and it may seem horrific at first, but the people that we should really feel sorry for are actually the Israelis or the ancient Israel soldiers who are actually doing the killing. Do I have that right?
There was something about I do remember I wrote an article on it all the way back. I'd have to look at it. The sort of the Amalekites, I think, and his justification of that was quite something. And this is your motivated reasoning plus cognitive dissonance. So, which is to say that I have a core belief here that God is good and I am good, and I believe in God because God is good and I am good, right? And then you have some evidence against that. How do I harmonize this evidence? So God ordered, or God, countenanced slavery. God countenanced massacring innocent people. How do I harmonize that so that I can maintain my core belief that I'm good and God is good? And so all sorts of funky stuff happens. And what happens very often is something that I coined this from Richard Carrier, possibiliter ergo probabiliter, which is it's possible, therefore it's probable. So what I think a lot of theologians and Christian apologists do is they say, here's an answer that could be true, therefore it's the answer and it's most probable. Right.
That's the logic of Ancient Aliens, that show on the History Channel. It's like, it could be true, so hey, it has to be true.
And what happens is you compound these probabilities. So when you say this could have happened, and then this could have happened, and then this could have happened, and then this could have happened, each could is, say, I don't know, let's make that up, 10%. So to get to the final one, if it's dependent upon each of these coulds, it's 10% of 10% of 10% of 10%. Which ends up being a very low probability. So when you start throwing in these coulds and mays and modal sort of words, probability words, then you compound the probability to become a conclusion that's very, very implausible indeed. And I see that happening all the time. But certainly that it's possible, therefore it's probable, is a real problem.
True enough. So we've covered a good amount of the podcast of William Lane Craig, and you said that you're writing a book on the resurrection. You want to touch base on that a bit?
Yeah, so I wrote a book on the nativity back in a long time ago, Nativity of Critical Examination. In fact, I'm debating Lydia McGrew on that on Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio in 10 days' time. And I am bookending Jesus' life. So you've got the nativity, so it'll be that way for you guys, nativity, and then you've got the resurrection, and everything in between. So these two bookends intersect with history quite nicely. So the nativity, you're talking about Herod, you're talking about census of Quirinius, you're talking about all these things that are historical, that intersect with known history. And then with the resurrection, you've got Pontius Pilate, you've got burial techniques and all practices and all these kind of things that we can look at, and crucifixion techniques and practices and blah, blah, blah. So you say, right, okay, we've got historical verifiability of these two parts of Jesus' life. Turns out that when you analyze them, they absolutely fail. The Christian claims fail, right? And that's really interesting. So if you start with his life here and the claims fail when they intersect with history, what can you say about this middle period where none of the claims intersect with known history? So when they do intersect with known history, they fail, and that's what I'm showing in both books. When they don't intersect, what epistemic right do you have to believe these claims? The wedding of Cana, right? Who was there? How do we verify this? What happened? How do you know? Driving the pigs off the cliff into the water. Who was there? How do we know that happened? How do we know that this was exorcising demons in the pigs? All those claims in the whole of Jesus' life are mere assertions from ex post facto David Koresh style biographers, right? Who are evangelizing the wonderful nature of Jesus. Right, and these are assertions that have no intersection with reality, with history. And over here, where they do intersect, they fail. Do you know what I mean? So that's why I think you show that these fail, then you have no right to believe this.
Exactly.
And if you show the resurrection is properly problematic, then really you don't have Christianity. So if you don't believe in resurrection, then you're not a Christian. That is the whole point of it.
I heard a criticism about when talking about burial rites, or you mentioned burial rites, that if there was a person named Jesus, if he was crucified, he would have just thrown into a pit with a bunch of other common criminals. Is that true?
Yeah, for sure. So this is I spent a massive section talking about burial practices, but essentially high treason, he was done for high treason, right, which is the worst crime, and there's lots of documentation to say that basically he would have been thrown into a shallow grave, and you wouldn't have known where he was buried. There is a theory to say that some Jewish practice would say they need to be taken down by the holy day if they're crucified, except this didn't happen very often, and blah, 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 and there's arguments about this. But if you agree that, okay, some pious Jew did take him down from the cross and put him and this to me is applause. This is my favorite theory of what happened. He was taken down just before the Sabbath, and then put in a tomb or somewhere else very temporarily, so that they fulfilled scriptural requirements. Jesus' followers knew that he was buried there, but whoever owned the tomb or whatever said, right, Sabbath is over, he's off out, let's get him out and let's put him in the criminal grave, shallow grave. Jesus' followers come back to that tomb. Holy shit, he's not here. Body's disappeared.
Right.
And then out of that, you get legendary embellishment that we know happens. We get hallucinations we know happen. I mean, there's so much data on hallucinations, certainly in grief situations, especially when you feel guilty and all sorts of stuff. So this would have been prime. So even if only a couple of them had hallucinations about that, they get embellished. And over the series of time, you look at the claims of not Sathis Sai-Baba, Sabbatai Sadi. So this apostate from where he was this Jewish Messiah figure, right? And then there were loads of miracle claims written about him, loads of saints parading around like cities around the time I think it was the 1500s or whenever. He then became an apostate to Islam, and the cognitive dissonance all his followers went through. It's fascinating, right? Because you got all similar sorts of claims, and yet you're like, well, these are nonsense, obviously, and yet they're not nonsense for Jesus. And here we have cognitive dissonance, followers believing one thing, but then that being blown out of their minds as it becomes an apostate to Islam. So how do they react? How does cognitive dissonance work? What happens to the miracle claims? And blah 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 blah. And you can fully see how the whole Jesus movement would have worked. The idea that the body may have been put in a tomb and then moved is really plausible, buried in a criminal's graveyard. And the fact that his tomb was not venerated ever until it was found 400 years later, which is not the tomb. So it was never venerated. Well, what explains why it wasn't venerated? If you had God dying in human form, right, and being buried in a place and then resurrecting in front of a bunch of people, supposedly, or not, no, actually no one saw him resurrect, but he made a bunch of appearances to people. Like, that place would be #1 shrine.
Yeah.
Never heard of again. Joseph of Arimathea, never heard of again. I won't bore you about Joseph of Arimathea. But
okay. Well, we're running down on our time, but I do want to piggyback on that. Is that the idea about Jesus being temporary, the body being temporarily in a tomb and then being taken out of a tomb and going into a shallow grave or whatever? That is still much more plausible than magic, Jonathan.
Much. And this is the thing. So at the end of the book, I've said, broadly, I can say anything. It doesn't really matter what I think about what actually happened, because virtually every single thing I could come up with or that other people have thought about is inherently more plausible than the Christian thesis, which is, again, goes back to extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is to say these are massively extraordinary claims. You need massively good evidence to support them. You don't have it. Here's a problem. I explain this data with something that is far more plausible Therefore, I am more justified and warranted in my belief that, the theory that I just gave you.
So, Jonathan, we're heading down towards the hour. Final question. This is the typical final question, though it's always a special final question because everyone has a different answer. Is there a topic you wanted us to talk about that we didn't get to? Was there an aspect of the conversation or the matter at hand that we just didn't explore? This isn't about plugs, of course, or where people can find you online. We'll do that in a minute. But is there something you want to chat about that we just didn't get time to?
I love chatting about everything, Andy. And no, because everything's open for a chat. I mean, I'm amazed that we haven't mentioned Trump. Damn, I've just mentioned Trump.
Well, I have to tell you something. I was really, you might find this surprising, that there are topics I talk about that are not Donald Trump. I've had a bunch of people come through here without talking about Trump. And and now that the monster seems to be rescinding into the darkness, hopefully he does not cast such.
No, but I think what the interesting scenario is truth, disinformation, misinformation, and what we do in conspiracy theories and what we do with it. And is there a case for regulating the media, or do you just let the free market, let the media say what they population to such a degree that it becomes dangerous? And I think these are the questions that were more pertinent. So what's happening with Fox News? Do they try and win back their OAN Newsmax apostates by becoming OAN and Newsmax, or do they drive through a more moderate line and try and undermine those other two networks using other techniques? I don't know. That's really interesting to see. What do we do with? I've seen friends who or people I know who believe, British people who believe some of these conspiracy theories.
The funny thing about Fox News is that they're in a similar situation the NRA was years ago, because the NRA had all these other gun groups that were more radical than they were. And the NRA decided they were going to become radical too.
Yes, I wrote a post the other day on exactly this, and I equated it to what the Conservative Party did in the UK when UKIP came along. So in the early 2010s, UKIP came to prominence. In the mid 2010s, they became an electoral force, and they were originally your fringe right wing Eurosceptics, sort of salivating at the more extreme ideas, and they became more and more popular. And then the Conservative Party had to do something about it. So what did they do? They actually assimilated them and took them in by moving more to the right, taking on the more Eurosceptic, anti-this, anti-that stances, to the point that half of the MPs now for the Tory party are that kind of right-wing, sort of, I'd say, extremist, but the extreme end of the right wing. Exactly that. The same kind of NRA analogy. That's what happened. That's how they have dealt with it. And then you're in a position where we polarize, and that will that happen in America, where Fox will go even further to the right to try and retain that, and you polarize the media.
Yeah. It's either, they are on the horns of the dilemma, Fox News. They either have a real potential to fade into irrelevancy for the right amongst its viewers, or they have to drill down. They have to drill down deeper into crazy. And that's not good for the country.
And so, at the end of the day, they news organizations are first and foremost businesses, right? When they are not state broadcasters, they are businesses. So therefore, they have to think of their consumer. What do their end users want, and deliver that? I mean, the only nugget of hope that I get is something like James Murdoch walking away from Fox because of Fox in Australia's position on climate change and basically trying to undermine climate science. And then all the wildfires in Australia, and James Murdoch just saying, no, I'm not having any of this. And if people at the top are doing that, then that gives you some kind of hope. But I don't know.
Well, before we close the show down, we do have some kind words here for Jonathan. I'm hoping we can have Jonathan Pearce back soon, because the discussion was interesting and was just too darn short. Well, as all of you know, I co-host the daily atheist morning show at 9 a.m. and I need to get my brain situated. That's what I'm going to use that word. I'm going to make up a word, Jonathan. Situated.
All right, Trump.
And kind words for me, which I'm not used to, but I'm going to say them out loud because that'll help me. This is therapy for me, Jonathan. If you haven't figured out this whole enterprise is just therapy for me. From AA, I Heart Andy, such a regular down-to-earth person. So it seems really good at following a conversation, good questioning for the guest. Thank you very much. Jonathan M.S. Pearce, where can people find you online, sir?
A Tippling Philosopher at the Patheos Network, the non-religious channel, or in my house where I live. But don't come find me there.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jonathan. This is always fun. I had a really good time, and I learned stuff.
Man, I love you, Andy. You take care. All the best. Stay safe.
Okay. Take